I'm Sheila Hollis. I'm the Acting Executive Director of the United States Energy Association. We are delighted and proud to be joined this morning with Clyde Luton from CalISO and my friend and colleague Jake Swanson in DC. We are honored to have Mr. Luton with us. Just a moment about what USEA is and what it does. USEA is a nonprofit, non-lobbying, nonpartisan organization. We work in 104 countries throughout the world, hand in hand with USAID, the Department of Energy, and the Department of State. And then additionally, we convene meetings to educate and inform all who are interested free. And of course, most of them have been virtual lately, but we hope to go back live very soon. And we're honored and delighted to have Mr. Luton with us and my dear colleague, Jake Swanson, who will introduce the details of the program. Jake, why don't you take it away?
Sounds good. Thank you, Sheila. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on what part of the world you're located in. And thank you for attending today's webinar on using renewables to operate a low carbon grid. My name is Jake Swanson. I'm a program coordinator at the U.S. Energy Association on the Energy Utility Partnership Program based in DC. Please note this webinar is being recorded and that all participants are muted with their video turned off. You're welcome and definitely encouraged to post questions either in the chat or the Q&A box below. We're going to have a great discussion today, so I'm sure there won't be a shortage of questions. You can find recordings of past webinars on the bottom of our website at usca.org/EUPP/webinars. And these are some of our plethora of webinar series that are available to you all for free. This webinar is part of our Ancillary Services webinar series that's in partnership with Greening the Grid India program. And it's aimed at presenting options for how ancillary services can be used to help integrate more renewable energy sources onto the grid while improving system reliability. Today's webinar will cover two tests conducted by California's independent system operator, CAISO, that demonstrate how large utility scale solar, photovoltaic, and utility scale wind resources can provide essential reliability services. Today, we have the pleasure of having Clyde Luton, who is a principal of renewable energy integration at CAISO. He actually developed the ISO's original duck curve to demonstrate how the increasing amount of variable resources will change how the balancing of the grid is managed. He was also instrumental in working with NERC to identify ramping capability or flexibility as an essential reliability service. Clyde holds BS and MS degrees in electrical engineering from Howard University in Washington, DC, and is a senior member of the IEEE. So with that, I'll pass the floor over to Clyde.
Thank you, Jake. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
No.
I think if you hit the share screen button again and then go through it again, you can get it. While Clyde's getting his screen ready, I just wanted to promote one of our upcoming webinars on July 29th. It's on microgrid planning, and we have great speakers from SEPA and John Lemire from North Carolina to talk about microgrid planning and in our grid modernization webinar series. So we're excited to have them on July 29th. So please stay tuned for an invite to that webinar.
So can you see it now, Jake?
Not yet. So if you hit share screen and then select the screen and then hit the share button again after that in the bottom right corner. There we go. Great.
Got it?
Yep. And then if you just want to go into present mode and then you can go ahead and get started.
Okay.
There we go.
Good morning, good evening, good night for some of you. As Jake mentioned, my name is Clyde Lutan. I work for the California ISO. Today we talk about two tests that the California ISO did over the past couple of years, one with a 300 megawatt solar plant and the other with 131 megawatt wind plant. So before we get into the tests themselves, a little about the California ISO. We did peak in 2006 at 50,270 megawatts. We basically, control the high voltage electric grid in California and parts of Nevada. Within California and parts of Nevada, we operate 26,000 circuit miles of transmission, and this is everything above 115,000 volts. We serve approximately 225 million megawatt hours of electricity. We got about almost 75,000 megawatts of power plant capacity, serve 32 million customers. And if you look at the lower left, this is the US, and the California ISO is one of 9 ISOs or RTOs within the United States. So moving on, what's really driving the need for renewables and the test that we did? Well, most of you may be familiar, California has an aggressive energy and policy goal. So at the very top, you'd see by 2020, we exceeded 33% renewables. The new target now is 60% renewables by 2030. And by 2045, we're looking at 100% zero carbon. Now, between 2030 and 2045, currently we do not count large hydro towards renewables or rooftop solar PV. By 2045, we will be able to count rooftop PV and large hydro units. Today, only hydro units less than 30 megawatts, that's run-of-the-river hydro, is counted towards renewables. In terms of greenhouse gas emission, 1990 levels, we were looking at reducing, by 2020, reducing greenhouse gas emission to 1990 levels. By 2030, that reduction is going to be roughly 40%, and 2050, 80%. By 2030, California is looking at roughly 5 to 7 million electric vehicles. Currently, we got a little over 12,000 megawatts of rooftop PV, and by the end of this year, the target is 2,000 megawatt of batteries. Now, with electric vehicles, I may get into this, further down, but we're currently looking at ways how can we use electric vehicles to help us with frequency control, and we can elaborate on that a little more. So the gist here is decarbonizing the grid is creating a lot of opportunities, not only on the grid side, but also on the distribution side. And we can talk a little more about that as we go along. Now, what are some of the challenges that the ISO face currently? Now, every system is different. If you integrate wind, it's a lot different than if you integrate solar. And it also depends on the resource makeup of your existing resources. But currently, the California ISO, we are seeing some huge intra-hour ramps. And that's about plus or minus 7,000 megawatts in an hour. And that's a lot of megawatts to move in 1 hour. Also, during sunset, we see the need to ramp up about 17,000 megawatts. So it's a lot of flexible capacity that you need to give you that kind of ramping capability. And now, especially with solar and solar PV, we see the system change your net load, which is your load minus wind minus solar, by roughly plus or minus 1,000 to 1,500 megawatts in 10 minutes. And that's a lot of changes to deal with if you operate a market or just controlling the grid as a whole. So as most of you may realize, we operate a market in that every 5 minutes, or in real time, every 5 minutes, we find the cheapest energy within the ISO and external to the ISO to serve the forecasted load. And we also balance the system every 4 seconds to make sure that the intra 5-minute variability is addressed. So we started to see now the regulation that we procure, which is really to take care of the intra 5-minute variability. In some 5-minute intervals, we run out of regulation. Basically, between sunrise and sunset, we tend to see now a lot of oversupply, a lot of generation. You tend to see high area control area. You tend to see high frequency in the system. Now, one of the things I had mentioned as the California ISO is one of 9 RTOs within the Cal ISOs, not Cal ISOs, the Western interconnection footprint. We have 14 states that the ISO is part of. So the system frequency, if something happens all the way in Colorado, we see an impact. So controlling system frequency is pretty critical. It's one of the NERC requirements. And that requirement is every minute we have an obligation as a balancing authority to support the interconnection frequency. This is why in the US, integrated renewables is a little more challenging because we have a lot of real-time control performance standards that you must comply with. So we can talk a little more about that further down. And what we started to also see is, again, between sunrise and sunset, especially during the non-summer months, we tend to see a lot of oversupply. And this is primarily due to lower loads on weekends and high renewable production. So this plot here on the left shows you the net load. A net load is really your load minus wind minus solar production. And this is back in March last year. We looked at 7 different days, and you can see how the net load changes from one day to the next. So a lot of people think that you can forecast wind and solar, and it's pretty easy. Well, the forecasting is a challenge now. In the old days, forecast, you had one variable, which was really your load, and the load was temperature dependent. So if you knew what the temperature was, then it's fairly easy to predict what your load's going to be. But today, when you have wind, you got solar, you got rooftop PV, and you got your load, it's pretty difficult day ahead to forecast every hour what that load or interaction is going to be between load, wind, and solar. So the forecast, as I said, needs to be fairly accurate because you need to make sure you commit the correct resources with adequate flexibility to meet your demand next day. Well, if you look at the right shows you the 10-minute variability that we see today. And we tend to see higher variability during sunrise and then during the evening hours during sunset. Now, these blue bars, they are 2 standard deviations. So roughly 95% of the variability falls within these blue bars. With that, I'm going to move on to some of the challenges that we also see. If you look at the left shows you on days when you had very little wind, and wind is just green at the top, and the yellow is solar production. So there are many days when the production is not as high. So question is, well, what do you do? So we rely a lot on gas resources when wind and solar, during the winter months, because of cloud covers, et cetera, you tend to see low renewable production. So basically, this plot here is to make policy decision makers aware that it's not that easy to get rid of the gas fleet, because on some days you need it. This plot here is also important because it's something that we're trying to figure out how much long-term storage we need on the grid to fill in for multiple days when you have very low wind and solar production. And then you look at the right, this is during May timeframe, spring conditions when you have a lot of snow melt from the mountains. You have a lot of hydro, which is this blue area right here. So this light green is how much energy we import. And you can see the thermal fleet is back down quite a bit. Now, for some of the electrical engineers out there, when you have very little thermal plants online, it impacts your ability to get adequate ancillary services. It also impacts your ability to meet frequency response, especially for high frequency events. And even for low frequency events, you do not have a lot of gas units online to give you that frequency response in case you lose a large generating unit. So the gist of this whole slide is to show that as we integrate more and more renewables has to play an essential role in providing essential grid services. And also storage needs to play an important part, and not only providing ancillary services, but flexibility and overall controllability. So again, this was one of the reasons why we embarked on those two tests. And some of you may be familiar with the duck curve. Well, the question is, what is the duck curve really telling us? Well, it's telling us that integrating renewables is creating some significant challenges between sunrise and sunset. It's not that we cannot deal with it, but by pointing out the challenges we're seeing currently, we know that innovative solutions, with universities and also developers, they're going to think of creative ways to help us solve some of these problems. And we talked a little about oversupply conditions. So to mitigate some of this, we need economic bids, not only from conventional units, but also from renewable resources. To bid, deck bids, where if you have too much generation on the grid, you can use those units to, if the price is right, to back off. The California ISO also looked at time of use rates, which would incentivize customers to do all the electric needs, let's say during the middle of the day, when you have excess energy on the system. So the idea here is to come up with a super off-peak rate where you'd incentivize customer to essentially raise the belly of the duck. Now, again, flexible capacity from all resources is something that we need, also ramping capability. And you also need to maintain sufficient capacity during periods of low renewable production, right? When you have multiple days with very low wind speed, or you have a lot of cloud covers. What we also notice is during sunrise, the speed at which the solar comes out is very fast. And you do not have the load to consume the solar that's coming up. And not only the grid connected solar, because we have control of the grid connected solar, but we, as I mentioned, we got over 12,000 megawatts of rooftop solar PV, and you have no controllability on that. You have no visibility. So that creates a huge challenge for system operators in that you got to control a grid through a market every 5 minutes and through automatic generation control every 4 seconds. And on some days, especially weekends when your loads are low, 25% or more of the supply is from rooftop PV, and you have no visibility. So that's a huge challenge, and it's something that we need to get a better handle on. Either forecasters that can forecast rooftop PV production with a fair amount of accuracy. And one of the other things too in your system, renewable resources, to help us control the grid, they need to follow dispatch instructions. So if a balancing authority like the ISO gave renewables instructions to either back down or increase production if they have headroom, or if they're not operating at full capacity, they need to be able to follow those dispatch instructions. So essentially, what everything we talked about so far is to do one thing here, is to flatten the belly of this duct. This is where you have a lot of concerns, a lot of challenges today. And if you get some time and you look at the ISO's website, we got about 8 initiatives right now that we're looking at to help flatten the belly of the duct. One is electrifying the transportation fleet, time of use rates and load shifting, shaping loads. So it's a slew of things we're looking at. Another thing we're looking at is expanding the footprint. So we currently operate our market beyond California. So we by 2023, we're going to be looking at the energy imbalance market being operated in 20, not 20, but by 2023, we're going to be looking at 22 participants participating in this energy market. So far, we already saw over $1 billion in savings to all EIM participants. And by 2023 timeframe, more than 83% of the load in the Western United States, so this is the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, which is the 14 Western states, the CAL ISO, will be serving approximately 83% of that load. Now, with that, before we get into the gist of the presentation, I'll pause there for a second to see if there are any questions out there, Jake, on the initial 8 slides that we talked about.
Yeah, we have a couple. I'll go with this one because it seems like the most relevant. Are there any restrictions or limitations for connecting intermittent sources of generation, like solar or wind, to the grid?
And then the first part of that was, are there any, you said?
Restrictions or limitations?
Restrictions. Well, the restrictions, yes, there are, because as I mentioned, when we operate, you got a few things that you have to look at. So the system operators, they got to make sure that they operate or help support the interconnection frequency. We also have limits that's set by the North American Electric Reliability Council. And what that means is we have to operate between tight frequency bands. So your area controller and your frequency needs to fall in within those time, those curves. Also, we have a frequency response guideline that if something happens, we got 52 seconds where we need to react. And then also we have a contingency reserve standard where if you lose any element on the system, you're going to recover within 15 minutes. And So when we integrate renewables, you got to make sure that you can meet those standards in real time. So you got to set the system up ahead of time. So if it means curtailing renewables, you're going to have to, because you do not want to operate a system where you're going to ship some of your problems off to a neighboring system. So it's pretty strict standards that we got to follow. And with those strict standards, we may have to curtail renewables in order to meet or comply with those standards.
Thank you, Clyde. And then one other one that's relevant is are landfill gas power plants considered to be in the thermal category?
Right now, yes, because the landfill gas, well, let me take that back, sorry. So I think I was thinking about something else, that you need that gas to power a different type of unit. So, but the landfill gas we have, they count towards renewables. So this is essentially biomass and biogas, and I think that's what the question related to. So biomass, biogas, and geothermal today, they count towards renewables in California.
Okay, got it. Thanks, Clyde. That's all for now.
Okay, so moving along, ancillary services, and most of you know what ancillary services are, and essentially what it is the necessary support that we need on the transmission to ensure that you can transmit that energy to load and at the same time meet reliability, safety, and you need to do all of that in accordance with good utility practice. So as I mentioned, you cannot ship. If you have too much generation on your system, you cannot allow that excess energy to flow in your neighboring system. You got to contain that, or do the best you could to contain that within your system. So that's one of the big difference, and what makes it a challenge to integrate renewables in the US. So the second bullet there is what we consider as ancillary services, is frequency response, regulation up, down service, spinning reserve and non-spinning reserve capacity. Some folks do count black start capability as ancillary services, or voltage control, even imbalance energy, which is how much energy you need to have as replacement, or flexible capacity. We do not consider these ancillary services today, but who knows, down the road, we may have to consider some of these as ancillary services, but today they do not count. Now, so just one more slide about the way ancillary services work in the California ISO's market. So ancillary services in the day-ahead market may or may not be or need to be accompanied by energy bids. But in the real-time market, they must be accompanied. So if you're bidding spin, non-spin, you need to have an energy bid in the real-time market. The contingency reserve requirement, this is in case you lose a large unit in real-time operation. That amount of reserve is set by the Western Energy Coordinating Council, and in some other balancing authorities by the North American Electric Reliability Council. And it varies from one state to the next, or from one B to the next. In the West, we all carry reserves based on a percentage of load. So the ancillary services in the ISO market is co-optimized with energy. So everything there is based on lease costs, or the prices reflect the marginal cost, and it includes the availability costs and loss opportunity costs. Spin and reserve, we try to procure 100% in the day-ahead market. And in real time, if we anticipate being short on ancillary services, we could procure that through the real-time market, which we run every 15 minutes and also every 5 minutes. So the other thing, when we procure ancillary services, you want to make sure that that ancillary service is deliverable. So with that now, the North American Electric Reliability Council created a work group about roughly 6 years ago to look at what would it take to integrate higher and higher levels of renewables. And this work group was created or was comprised of engineers from throughout the US. And these are the three essential grid services that we came up with. One was frequency control, the second was voltage control, and the third was ramping or flexible capacity needs on the system. So when we created the test, we wanted to see, can renewable resources provide these essential grid services? So this plot here shows you the first test that we did. It was a 320 megawatt solar PV plant. This solar PV plant, the footprint is on the lower or bottom part of this slide. So each one of those inverters is a 4 MVA, and then you've got 10 inverters making up one block. Then you've got 8 blocks. And the beauty about this is each inverter can operate independently. But at the top here, you have this plant controller that controls those inverters. So in other words, if the ISO or any balancing authority sends instructions to a PV plant, even though the PV plant has individual inverters, the plant controller, which today is needed on the grid, they coordinate all the responses from the individual inverters to make that plant operate like a large synchronous resource. So the plant controller is, as I said, a smart controller. It would move those controller to react to a dispatch signal from, let's say, the California ISO. So we tell our solar plants to move up or to move down. The plant controller would precisely control the movement of that plant. Now, before we did the test, right here, these 2 red dots, we installed some phaser units, and that was really to measure the response from the plant to the test signals that we sent. Now, the test that we embarked on, there was, basically regulation up, down, frequency response. We changed the droop settings. We changed the bandwidth settings on the solar plant. We also wanted to see how well this plant could respond to megawatt control from the ISO. And then we looked at voltage control, different types of control. So either a scheduled voltage or megawatt control, or even a power factor control. And then basically how well everything is, how well under normal steady state condition can the solar plant react to a dispatch signal from the ISO. This first plot here shows you this 320 megawatt plant. We dial in, and the software changes is very easy to make on these plants. So we wanted to see how this plant could react or would react if we had a ramp rate that was roughly 10% of Pmax. So we said 30 megawatts a minute, and the red is really the set points that we dial into this unit. So we looked at taking this plot from roughly 270 megawatts to 0 and back up to the capability. And you can see how well a solar plant can follow the set points. And this was, fairly accurate. It was encouraging to see solar plant being so responsive to set point signals from the ISO to either ramp down or ramp up. And you can see the reactive power, when we did that movement on the active power, which is your megawatts, the reactive power stayed pretty flat, right? Now, looking at this plot here is really showing the 4-second control. We did this test in 3 different timeframes. We did it during the morning, around midday, and then we looked at how well this plant can respond on evenings, during sunset. So the results were more or less similar for all three tests. So what we did, this green bar right here at the very top shows you the capability of that plant for some irradiance level, right? So what we did is we backed this plant off by 30 megawatts. And then we fed this plant an actual AGC signal from the ISO that we fed into the plant controller. And it was the duration was 15 minutes and is every 4 seconds. So if you look really close, you'd see a red curve at the back. And so that's the 4-second AGC signal that you sent to this plant. And when you look at the yellow, this was amazing to see how well this PV plant could follow a 4-second signal. So again, this was very, very encouraging to see a PV plant being able to follow a dispatch instruction in the regulation timeframe. Now, what's really interesting about this plot, also when we look, and in the US, we pay units provided in regulation not only for the capacity, but we also pay for how well they can follow a dispatch instruction. So we refer to that as a mileage charge, so which means how much times they move up and down. You measure that and see how well these plants can follow a dispatch instruction. The solar plants were able to perform over 94% or follow that instructions about 94% of the time. The best gas plant was able to do that about 60% of the time, and the hydro was right about the same thing. So right there, solar plants demonstrated that they can follow dispatch instructions a lot better than conventional units. So again, it was an eye-opener, and it's very encouraging for integrating renewables on the grid. This plot here shows a couple of things. One, this was an actual low-frequency event, which is this white plot. So for an actual low-frequency event, we wanted to see how well this solar plant could respond, not only for frequency regulation, but also for frequency response. So some of you that's familiar with the inertia timeframe, like in the Western interconnection here, we see minimum frequency within 8 seconds following disturbance. Well, this plant, depending on how fast you set that droop setting, you can see how quick this solar plant was able to respond, which is that yellow. So you can also respond within the fast frequency response timeframe. So if frequency response is an issue, within, let's say, you do not have a lot of inertia on the system, solar plants, they can help you in that transient period. And also, what we did is we repeated this test, and on this plot, we looked at a 3% droop. We also looked at a 4% droop and a 5% droop, and which means is how well these units can respond, or this unit would be able to respond to a droop setting. And then also on the deadband, which is when would this plant respond to a frequency deviation. Currently within the US is 36 millihertz. So within 36 millihertz, the governors do not really react, but frequency deviation outside that, we get governor action or governor response that helps us control system frequency. So moving on to the voltage control test. Well, this, I did not want to change this plot on the right because this is what we wanted to test the unit at. So back then, FERC did not come up with a voltage requirement for inverter-based resources. So back then in the 2017, early 2018 timeframe, the California ISO, we were contemplating reactive support, and at the very top, at full megawatt output, we wanted to see 0.95 lead, 0.95 lag in terms of reactive or voltage control at the very maximum megawatt output. And the V shape really tells you as the megawatt output decreased, the reactive support, it was okay to decrease that. And even below 10% of the actual megawatt output, we were not expecting these plants to respond. Well, as it turns out, when we were doing this test, the results were very, very encouraging. And those two plots that you see, this yellow, this blue dash line and the red dash line is what the plant can actually do. So it's a lot better response, and I get into that in my next slide, than what we were expecting. And when you look at the plot on the left, you can see for the synchronous resource, this is your voltage capability here. This area right here, because you got a lot of limitations on synchronous resources. But a PV plant, you can get this semicircle here, which is lagging, leading power factor control. That's a lot better than a conventional resource. So again, this was very encouraging. This plot here, as I said, it's back to this plot on the right. It shows you, this is the actual controls when we did that test. So at maximum megawatt output, this plant was able to provide full, and not only reactive, but dynamic reactive. And at 0 megawatt output, or very close to 0, it was also able to provide 9.95 lead per 0.95 lag power factor. So you get almost full reactive control if this plant is really offline or is generating very, very little actual megawatts. This plot here shows you one thing, and it is the active power control and the reactive power control is independent. So at the first part of this plot, you can see this orange curve here. So we moved this unit quite a bit from about 260 megawatts to 0 back and forth. And if you look at this yellow curve, you can see how stable the voltage, and this is your voltage on your high side of your step up transformer back, it was pretty stable. But only when you move the megavar output, you see the voltage change. So the active power control and the reactive power control, it's independent. We saw that with the controls of this unit. So again, very encouraging response. This one plot here shows you at maximum output, we were able to ramp this unit up to 100 megawatts. So roughly, if you're looking at how much reactive a typical plant could produce, it's roughly 1/3 of the megawatt capability. So roughly 100 megawatts for a 300 megawatt unit. So both in the boosting and the bucking test. So we were able to consume 100 megawatts and control voltage by operating at a lagging power factor or producing megawatts to the extent of roughly 100 megawatts. The last test we did here, and this was very interesting, again, looking at this plant operating at roughly 0 megawatts. So we backed that plant off to 5 megawatts. And you can go lower also because the controls are very, very independent. And this red curve is really the voltage set point. And you can see how this reactive increase and decrease. But the beauty about this green curve here is this 320 megawatt plant was able to control the 230 kV voltage, and you can see a swing here of roughly 15 to 16 kV. So we'll be able to boost that voltage or consume reactive and lower that voltage. And again, this test really demonstrated that at night with no solar, a solar plant could help control voltage on the system. This here is just a summary of the test results. And, we went over these. And I would like to pause here for another minute or two to see if there are any questions there on the solar test that we conducted.
Yeah, we've got a question. When the solar plant got a dispatch signal to reduce, did the excess power go to storage, or were PVs just taken offline?
So that's a good question, right? So currently, the big PV plants that we have, no, I should say, almost 14,000 megawatts of PV have no storage. The newer plants coming in now, they got storage. So to answer your question, when we curtail, you just lose that energy.
Gotcha. And you spoke about frequency response critically. How do you manage a good power factor given rooftop PV systems when gas generation is low?
So, so one of the things, the federal government implemented, and I think that was about 3 or 4 years ago, was they came up with an order requesting all new inverter-based resources provide dynamic voltage support. So they must provide voltage support, and they need to be able to control a scheduled voltage while operating within 0.95 lead, 0.95 lag at the high side of the transformer bank. So in other words, within the US on the grid, we do not operate to control a power factor. We operate to control a scheduled voltage. So on the 230 kV, let's say like in the San Francisco area, the scheduled voltage there is 230 kV, and we allow that to move to 232, 228 to 232. And the power factor range on that unit could vary, as I said, between 0.95 lead, 0.95 lag, to try to maintain that voltage between 228 and 232. Now, if that unit, let's say, is providing full reactive capability and the voltage is still low, then the planning engineers, they're going to come up with, they will identify that as a deficiency and either make decisions to install, shunt capacitor banks or do something else to, to make that voltage at that station fall within the scheduled voltage set points that we have set today on the system.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And we had another question, just a point of clarification. They just wanted to confirm, were you saying that, previously that solar PV is able to absorb the MVARs?
Yes. So the solar PV plant, they can operate similar to a conventional unit. So either a hydro unit or a gas unit, where you can operate at a lagging power factor, which means you're producing reactive onto the grid, or you can operate at a leading power factor, consuming reactive from the grid. The solar plants today, the newer solar plants, they can provide reactive support to the grid, and they can also consume reactive from the grid. So if your voltage is high, the inverters can operate in a manner to help reduce the voltage. And on this plot right here, you can see we were able to lower the voltage to roughly 225. So the actual operating range here is roughly 230, but we were able to consume reactive on this plant, which is this area right here, roughly 100 megawatts. The plant was able to consume to lower the voltage. So yes, the PV plants could both provide reactive and also consume reactive.
Mm-hmm. And also going back, you spoke about NERC requirements. Do renewables meet some of the thresholds for responsibility as DERs or aggregators?
So the rules are a little different when it comes to grid connected renewables, and also on the DER, they have interconnection requirements that's set by the distribution side. So everything that I had mentioned so far is grid connected. And so grid connected, we got this voltage control requirement that's set by NERC. And then also we have frequency response capability. So all new renewables now, or inverter-based resources, which includes storage, they need to provide frequency response. So if they're operating, they have headroom for some wind speed or some irradiance level, they must provide frequency response. So this is one way of trying to get controllability and maintain reliability as we integrate high and high levels of renewables. Now on the distribution side, and those of you that want to read a little more on what's happening in California, there's a California Public Utilities Rule. So it's a CPUC Rule 21 that goes into the interconnection requirement for the rooftop PV. So it started last year. Now they have certain requirements where they need to have low voltage ride-through capability, low frequency ride-through capability. And if you have, let's say, high frequency on the distribution, the rooftop PV, the new rooftop PV, they need to back off production. And if the frequency is high, they need to back off production. But we already have roughly 12,000 megawatts without that capability. So it's something that we realized that the grid needed support from the distribution side. And those were some of the rules that were implemented. The California Public Utility Commission is still working on modifying some of those rules in terms of active power management and other types of control. And that's still ongoing.
Gotcha. And talking about requirements, are there any requirements for installing battery energy storage systems when connecting intermittent sources of generation to the grid?
Well, there is no requirement, but what we started to see in the connection queue, we have a lot of solar plants now partnering with storage. So there are different ways, to look at this. If they have excess energy, and let's say we need to curtail, they could use that excess energy to charge the battery, and then during the evening, when the solar is dropping off, they can use that or convert that storage into energy. Also, if some plants want to mitigate the variability, they could use that storage to help flatten out the production from the solar plant or even a wind plant. Now, it's not a requirement from the ISO or from the California ISO to smoothen out that curve, because what we look at is, similar to a wind plant, geographic diversity minimizes variability. So you got a couple of plants, the variability could decrease. Sometimes it increases. So there's no set requirement to say each solar plant, you need to install storage. The reason why they install storage now is to qualify for tax credits and other incentives that there are out there, but not from an operational standpoint. You do not really need storage to partner with solar.
Mm-hmm. And then one more question, and then I'll save some more for the end. Reactive power limits are specified at what level? Is it the inverter level or the plant level or at the point of connection?
So we set the requirements, as a grid operator on the high side, right? So we say they need to operate or control a voltage on the high side, right? So whatever that translates to on the collector side, they can figure that out. But on the high side, the requirement in the US today is to control a scheduled voltage while operating between 0.95 lead, 0.95 lag on the high side of the transformer bank, right? So that would translate to something lower on the distribution side. But when we set the voltage requirements, is based on the point of interconnection or the high side of that transformer bank.
Got it. Okay, that's all for now, and then I'll save some for the end. But
Okay.
thanks, Clyde.
So moving on to the wind test. This was a 131 megawatt wind plant. I forgot to mention on the first test we did, it was between the California ISO First Solar and the National Electric Reliability Lab. So this test was conducted by the ISO, Avangrid Renewables. They own this wind facility, NREL and General Electric. So when we did this test, similar type configuration, you've got individual inverters controlling turbines, and then you have a controller that sits right here. And as I had mentioned with the solar plant, this smart plant controller controls the individual inverters to make this plant respond to signals from a balancing authority like the ISO. So just running into the test on the left-hand side, it shows you active power control, where we were able to ramp this unit down from roughly about 130 megawatts to 20 megawatts and back up at a constant ramp rate. So again, when you look at this, you can see how well a wind plant could follow a dispatch instruction from the control entity. So on the right, the control's a little different. We'll be able to ramp this unit at a constant power factor from roughly 130 megawatts to 0. But then coming back up, you can do a few things. And if you look at the right, this is the number of individual turbines that were committed. But in this mode, it's really, even though you have the turbines committed there, you do not recover. But so this mode of operation is to recover at a certain point in time. So if you see the response here, we backed this unit off, came back up a little, but then all of a sudden at this point, right just before 11 o'clock, we said, hey, give us everything you got. And you can see how quick this plant was able to respond. So it ignored the ramp rate and just gave you full capability. So if you need wind plants to operate quick, they can do that. If you need them to operate at a ramp rate, they can also do that. Now I'll just jump into frequency control. We wanted to see for a low frequency event, and this green here is really the capability of the plant itself, right? So for a low frequency event, which is this blue, you can see how this plant responded. And this is with the current settings that we have at the ISO, which is a 5% droop and a 36 millihertz deadband. And you can see you were able to get, in 20 seconds, you can get roughly 15 megawatt response for a low frequency event. While by just dialing a change, which is just a software change, from going from a 5% to a 4% droop, and changing that response time from 36 millihertz to 16 millihertz, you can see you can get roughly 4 megawatts more response by doing nothing other than changing the droop and the frequency bandwidth. So this was very interesting also. And then looking at the both response here, at 36 millihertz, so a 5% droop and a 4% droop, you can clearly see that you get better response with a 4% droop as opposed to a 5% droop, even though the deadband was the same, 36 millihertz. So this is one of the things, the California ISO is contemplating. We wanted to recommend all inverter-based resource operate at a 4% droop setting. We're also thinking of recommended a 16.7 millihertz bandwidth as opposed to 36 is something that we're going to stakeholder and recommend either at the end of this year or early next year, only because you need the controllability and you have inverter-based resources. They're sitting there, no moving parts, everything is software, and they can provide the additional controls that you need. Again, this here is looking at voltage, how well this wind plant can follow a voltage set point. We went over that in detail in the solar test, but at the end of this presentation, Jake's going to send out the slides so you guys can go back and look. And if you have any questions, always feel free to send me an email, with any questions you may have. So again, this is similar to operating the solar plant with no megawatt output. And on this test here, the wind plant was basically sitting at 0, and you were able to control system voltage. So the beauty about this wind plant, or the newer wind plants coming in with plant controller, even though the wind is not blowing, so you have no megawatt output, these plants can provide reactive control to help you control the grid. This plot here is looking at the capability. So again, you saw a version of this back in the solar test, where the synchronous machine can provide this area of support. Inverter-based resources can give you a lot more support, both in the leading power factor range and also in the lagging power factor range. So you get a lot more reactive capability or control capability with inverter-based resources. And my job here was to really look at the capability of these resources, but it is eventually going to come down to economics and who gets paid for providing what services. But again, the inverter-based resources out there, they do have the capability to provide essential grid services, which is what we really need to eventually migrate to a carbon-free grid. This here, I'm not going to go through each one of these bullet points, is really summarizing the findings of that wind test, and essentially is similar to the solar test in that wind plants, solar plants, and we're not sure yet, but later on this year, the California ISO is going to do a similar test with a 250 megawatt solar battery. And we're going to test, in addition to the test that we did for the wind and solar plants, we can also be looking at things like state of charge and other capabilities that's unique to storage technology. Like for instance, the ramp rate at full discharge or close to full discharge and things like that. So we're still working on a test plan, and we're going to be doing that test sometime in the August or September timeframe this year. And with that, the two tests that we conducted, the very first one is the solar test. The second one is the report that we put together on the wind tests. And with that, we can entertain any questions you guys may have before concluding.
Thank you so much, Clyde. And yeah, everyone will get the PowerPoint presentation sent out, and also these links will be available in the presentation and on the website. We did have a couple final questions. What do you think is the minimum rotating inertia required by CAISO?
We started looking at it, and then I know GE looked at a study and they did this about 2 years or 3 years ago, and they looked at the West as a whole, and they concluded back then that the West, which is part of, the ISO is part of the West, is inertia was not imminent problem for us, right? What was a problem was the frequency response capability of the system. So currently the whole West still has a lot of rotating mass. They still got a lot of coal plants. They still got a lot of conventional units, a lot of big hydro. So the inertia is not really a problem, but the frequency response is how much response you can get from resources that's online within 20 to 52 seconds. So that's the bigger concern. Now, eventually, if let's say we have newer standards or beyond 2030, we do realize we have an inertia problem, which means we cannot arrest system frequency. So we operate at 60 cycles and or 60 hertz. But if frequency drops, if you have a contingency and it drops to 59.5, that's when we start dropping load dramatically, right? So we have on the frequency relays that's set to drop blocks of load starting at 59.5. So now, today, when we do technical studies, we try to limit that drop. So we look at the largest contingency, and in the West, we look at the largest double contingency. And we try to reserve a margin between 59.5. So currently, like roughly 59.65. If the frequency drops, we know we're not going to trip load unintentionally, right? So that would be a driver to determine how much inertia we need on the system, right? So in other words, if we see that we cannot arrest frequency for the two largest units, so there are two nuclear plants in the West, if we lose those units simultaneously, if we see frequency, true technical study is going to drop, and the settling frequency, not settling frequency, but the frequency near the air approaches 59.5, then we're going to have to do something. That do something could be either tuning wind plants or solar plants to respond in the inertia timeframe. We can look at things like fast load rejection on the system, which is similar to megawatt injection on the system. So there are a lot of things that we can do to prevent tripping load unintentionally. So it's not a big concern that at least I have currently. I think there are ways that we can get around this as we integrate more and more renewables.
Great, thank you so much, Clyde. And can you kind of address how CAISO addresses contingency operations while having so many non-dispatchable resources?
So the contingency is, as we mentioned in the earlier slides, the contingency reserve requirement is set by two things, right? So in the West, what we look at is your most severe single contingency, right? Or roughly 6% of your forecasted peak load for that day, right? So whichever is higher, that's the amount of contingency reserve you need to carry. So in the day-ahead market, we make sure that we can buy or procure enough contingency reserve, which is comprised of spinning reserve and non-spinning reserve. And so with the technical studies that we did beforehand, we know if we procure that amount of contingency reserve, we can withstand the largest credible contingency that we expect to see on the system. So essentially, that's how we do it now. For more severe events like double contingencies, there are other standards that's different from the contingency reserve standard, like the frequency response standard. We know that other things or other standards are going to kick in to help us. But strictly for contingency reserve, we try to procure 100% in day ahead, knowing that based on technical studies, we should be able to withstand those contingencies without having a problem on the system. The biggest problem that we have currently is during the evening hours, during sunset, when you're trying to ramp up or meet 17,000 megawatts of ramp, which is due to your lost solar production plus your load increase on the evenings. If you have a large contingency during that time frame, what we do is we also make sure that we can reserve that contingency reserve requirement. So even though we in an upward ramp, we want to make sure that if a contingency happens, we could meet both. We could continue meeting that energy needs in addition to recover from that contingency. Because as I mentioned, if you have a contingency, we only have 15 minutes to recover ACE, the area control area, to where it was prior to that event. If you take longer than 15 minutes, like 15 minutes and 10 seconds, let's say, that's a violation. And you could get fined pretty heavy by the North American Electric Reliability Council or even FERC. So we have not been fined yet. So it's something that you take very, very seriously. You want to make sure you have enough contingency reserve, because if you have a violation, this could come with up to $1 million in fine per event. So you do not want to have a violation for things like contingency reserve or your ancillary service needs on the system right now. And it's a little stricter in the West. In addition to being fined monetarily, the West, they make you carry additional reserves for 3 months. So that's costly. So no balancing authority wants to fail contingency reserve requirements. So it's something you take very, very serious.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know how strict the regulations were and the requirements are. I'll close with 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. Can you provide some insights? What are your thoughts on a hybrid wind and solar on a common set of inverters?
You mean wind and storage, right?
It's the question says wind and solar, but they might have meant wind and storage.
Because most of the hybrids we see now is either solar and storage or wind and storage.
Mm-hmm.
We do not have a lot of experience with these currently. We're still working out some of the operational details. And we got 2 flavors. One is hybrid and one is co-located. And I think you will see some solar, wind, storage combinations, but we're still working on the operating requirements. And you do want to have some flexibility and also meet reliability. So it's something that we're working on right now, but I'm optimistic that we'd find ways, and we do stakeholder all of these requirements. So when we do come up with a plan, it's applicable. Is something that the stakeholders they want, and it's something that would make or help us operate in a reliable way also.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then my final question from the audience is, how costly are the inverters relative to the solar installed megawatts?
So that's an interesting question, but as an operating engineer or an engineer that looks at renewables integration, I do not look at cost. I look at capability, and I look at what's needed to maintain a resilient grid and how well we can meet those real-time standards that NERC requires. So there are other people in the company, they look at cost. There are developers, they look at cost. I look at what it is that we need on the grid to maintain, as I said, a resilient, reliable grid. So sorry for sidestepping that, but it's something, economics is not what I get involved with, strictly reliability.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Clyde. That was very insightful, and you answered close to 100 questions probably today. So I appreciate your flexibility with that. To all of our attendees, thank you for attending today's webinar. We'll be posting a recording of this webinar and the presentation on our website, and we'll be sending it out to you as well. Sheila, any final thoughts before I close out?
No, just other than Clyde, thank you so much for your incredible contribution and also for your hard work in California to keep everything steady, the lights on and the air conditioner going. And it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to have you, and we hope to welcome you back to many more things in the future. Thank you, Clyde.
Well, thank you, Sheila, and thank you to all participants also.
Yes, thank you so much, Clyde, and be on the lookout, all of our participants, for the link to the recording and the presentation. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you.